Esotericism is a bit of a fraught concept. Just what counts as esoteric? For instance, astrology would now be considered part of Western Esotericism, but in the Middle Ages it was a university-taught course, anything other than esoteric. Likewise, just what is Western about Western Esotericism? Where do we draw a line given the history of shifting religious boundaries, the import and export of ideas and practices, and the fact that so much of European cultural and religious identity is shaped by defining itself against its others, the heathen, the Jew, the Saracen, the heretic, etc. One of the fault lines for scholars in this field is drawing a line around just what Western Esotericism is and what it isn't. One of the frequent victims in this line drawing are the mystical ideas and practices of Judaism and Christianity, but also, I think even more radically, Islam. To my mind, this is a serious mistake. Here at Esoterica, we will explore the intersection of mysticism, religion, and magic as foundational to Western Esotericism. Certainly, one of these foundations must be the Jewish mystical texts and practices, which began to appear sometime during the early rabbinic period. The earliest mystical Jewish literature, aside from the theophanic, prophetic, and apocalyptic text of the Hebrew Bible, can be divided into three groups: the Merkabah/Hekhalot literature, the Sar Torah literature and its accompanying magical texts, and the brief but extraordinarily mysterious Sefer Yetzirah, or Book of Formation. This video is going to explore that early strata of Jewish mystical literature, typically known as the Hekhalot, or palaces, or the Merkabah, or chariot literature, where they descend, not ascend, into the divine palaces. They meet with fearsome angels, they gain control over that very angelic power, they become transformed into beings of fire, and mount the very throne of God to carefully measure the divine body itself. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. Mysticism, along with magic, is one of the most difficult and contested topics in Western Esotericism. Volumes have been written just attempting to provide a rigorous definition of both terms, and no single definition pleases everyone. In fact, two really substantial volumes have come out in the past several years just attempting to define magic. This is an entire text just attempting to define magic, and an excellent text which is attempting to get a grasp on a philosophical understanding of philosophy. Here is the Jones text, Philosophy and Mysticism, which runs into nearly 400 pages. So just attempting to get a philosophical or a scholarly grasp on what magic and mysticism are literally requires substantial monographs, and it pleases nobody. That said, I don't think there's going to be any analytical definition, giving the concepts a set of necessary and sufficient conditions of magic or mysticism forthcoming. This may be very dissatisfying for philosophers, me included, but such complex and variable terms may just admit of enough historical and cultural latitude that the concepts themselves are neither analytically clear, nor distinct, nor mere nonsense. They exist somewhere in between analytical clarity and nonsense, and therefore getting some definite analytical definition is probably going to be impossible. Such is the difficulty of working in this field. All that said, I'd like to offer three aspects of these early texts that I take to be mystical. First, they seem to be downstream of a phenomenological event rather than mere speculation, like previous apocalyptic texts. They're the result of some profound experience, in this case of a visionary descent into another reality. Secondly, these texts are also instructive. They describe how one might achieve a similar vision, and even describes the perils to avoid in that practice. This importantly separates the literature from earlier prophetic or even apocalyptic literature in the Hebrew Bible, and such texts as 1st Enoch. While previous texts describe the fantastic realms beyond this world, this literature admonishes and prepares the potential cosmic adventurer. In the Sar Torah literature, these instructions even extend to angelic theurgy, in which angelic powers are commanded in the service of immediate apprehension of both exoteric and esoteric rabbinic lore. Third, there's at least a whiff of the famed unio mystica, or the mystical union with the divine. I say a whiff because Jewish theological concerns at this time would forbid a straightforward divine union. The transcendence of God is a core theological value in these texts. That whiff takes the form of being seated on the divine throne, or even transformed into one of the beings of fire to serve, even if briefly, in the heavenly choir. These three aspects provide a salient enough distinction to the previous literature that I would maintain that they represent a transition from the exegetical pole into the mystical pole. Not that one can draw a clear and distinct line between those two boundaries, in all honesty. Secondly, it's really important to note that these texts do not constitute the Kabbalah. Jewish mysticism existed prior to the rise of the Kabbalah, beginning in the 13th century, with the composition and response to the famed Sefer Zohar. We should regard these texts as Jewish mysticism prior to the Kabbalah, although these texts will be absorbed into that later tradition, to be sure. I say this because we should be careful not to map later mystical concepts back onto this earlier strata of mysticism. We should let it stand on its own and speak on its own terms, with its own agenda. This will be especially true when we take a look at the Sefer Yetzirah in a future video. While the Sefer Yetzirah does introduce the neologism, the Sefirot Belima, it'd be a mistake to map the emanation scheme and symbol system from the later Sefer Zohar and Sefer Bahir back onto the Sefer Yetzirah. These forms of mysticism, the Hekhalot literature along with the Sefer Yetzirah literature, along with the Sar Torah and its magical extensions, survived and flourished for at least 800 years, just as long as the Kabbalah has existed hitherto. And it's key to appreciate that fact. As much as Kabbalah has come to dominate Jewish mysticism now, these forms of mysticism, these earlier forms of mysticism, stood on their own for centuries and should be appreciated as such. While apocalyptic literature, the most famous example being 1st Enoch, but many texts remain, provide descriptions of the heavenly realm and the cosmos generally, the Merkabah, the chariot literature, or the Hekhalot literature, the palace literature, reflects a transition from the exegetical to the phenomenological, from the literary or the speculative to the experiential. Of course, as I said earlier, that distinction is blurry to be sure, but I think it serves as a helpful heuristic for appreciating this form of literature and its accompanying mysticism. So what can we say about the Hekhalot literature or the Merkabah literature? These highly anthological texts are largely written in Mishnaic Hebrew and Aramaic, although sometimes there are Greek words, especially in the magical texts, and they typically deal with visions of God's chariot/throne. God's throne is often depicted as sort of a winged throne, a kind of chariot throne. And along with the Sar Torah literature also contains descriptions of the heavenly realms. They also deal with control over angels. The literature itself is sometimes rambling, and it's often a bit of a jumble. What we effectively have are small units of text, sometimes called microforms, which are edited together to form larger composite literature. We call those macroforms, although there's a lot of variation from manuscript to manuscript. They usually take the form of a Tana, a writer from the time period of the composition of the Mishnah, sometime roughly between the destruction of the temple and around the year 200 of the Common Era. And these Tanas are usually Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Ishmael, and Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana. And these texts describe the mystical descent of these rabbinical figures into the Hekhalot, into the palaces of God. They reveal the angelic hymns that they heard there, and they provide techniques for the reader to make that descent themselves. The texts themselves were likely composed after the period of the Tanaim, so we conclude that they're largely pseudepigraphic in character. This pseudepigraphic character of literature would continue in Jewish mysticism all the way through to the writing of the Sefer Bahir, allegedly by Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana, and eventually to the Sefer Zohar, allegedly written by Shimon Bar Yochai. However, I do think that these mystical practices do go back in time prior to the Tanaim. The Enoch literature strikes me as both partially apocalyptic, but also partially mystical. And there's a very mysterious passage in the book of 2 Corinthians where the Apostle Paul describes being caught up into the third heaven and overhearing divine secrets. And of course, there's a very famous section in Tractate Chagiga, the famous Pardes section, in which 4 of these descenders, Rabbi Akiva, ben Yoma, ben Zoma, and Elisha ben Abuya, who will become the Acher, the other, descend into the divine palaces. They encounter a kind of illusion, and this illusion, the failure to recognize this illusion, it's sometimes referred to as the water test in the literature, causes 3 out of the 4 descenders to either become mad, to die, or to become a heretic, to mutilate the shoots or mutilate the reeds in the case of Elisha ben Abuya. The only person to emerge successfully is the Hekhalot hero, Rabbi Akiva. While the evidence is spare, I'm relatively confident that this mysticism goes back at least to the period of the Second Temple, although further research will have to be done. The entire literature seems to exist on an axis. On one side of that axis is the Merkaba Hekhalot literature, in which the descenders to the throne enter into the divine palaces and learn divine secrets, including the dimensions of the body of God. On the other hand, we have the Sar Torah literature, which seems primarily to invoke theurgical powers over angels, specifically the Sar Torah, the Prince of the Torah, in order to use the power of those angels to summon the divine presence and learn the secrets of the Torah directly. So one pole represents the Hekhalot literature in which the descenders go to the throne of God, and the other pole of literature represents the summoning and theurgical power of the rabbinical figures to summon the Sar Torah and the divine presence to them. The more theurgic texts eventually give rise to more straightforwardly magical texts. The most famous of these, the Sefer haRazim, the Book of Secrets, we'll cover in a future video. So we have a kind of axis that looks a bit like this. On one side of it, we have the exegetical apocalyptic literature. We travel a little bit over, we have the mystical Merkaba Hekhalot literature. We travel a little bit further still, we have the theurgic Sar Torah literature. And on the other side of that pole, we have the more straightforward magical texts like the Sefer haRazim. Again, this isn't completely accurate, but I think it's helpful to understand the differences between these forms of mysticism and their accompanying literature. Of course, the Sefer Yetzirah is the outlier here, and it's going to require its own video. At least one video. I think you could probably do 50 videos in the Sefer Yetzirah. It's amazing how a small text like that can be so absolutely fecund with meaning, symbolism, magical power, and the most alluring mystery. I literally just reread the text yesterday, and it struck me as completely fresh and absolutely mysterious. All right, so what happens in the Merkaba Hekhalot literature and in the Sar Torah literature? Well, simply put, the descenders are given tours of the seven-tiered heavens, which are arranged like concentric rings, with the center ring, the largest, where resides the throne of God, surrounded by the vast hosts of angelic beings. As I've mentioned, in the apex of the experience, they're sometimes transformed into quasi-angelic beings of fire, much like the character Enoch was transformed into the angelic being Metatron in the Enoch literature. They're sometimes provided with mystical crowns, tagim, by the Prince of the Torah. They're instantly allowed access to both esoteric and exoteric religious lore. And in the most extreme examples, they're literally given visions of the exact dimensions of the body of God, down to the individual parasang. This literature is vast and varied, from carefully constructed poetry to long, rambling narratives, to lists of divine and angelic names, in words that seemingly have no clear meaning, very much like the magical terms found in the Greek magical papyri and the Gnostic texts of the Nag Hammadi library. About 47 manuscripts from the High Middle Ages survive, along with some texts from the Cairo Geniza. A Geniza is like a storage house. As you may know, in the Jewish tradition, if there are texts with the divine name on them, they're not allowed to be thrown away. They have to be stored and then eventually buried in a graveyard with great honors. The Geniza in Cairo is in the Ibn Ezra synagogue. It's sort of an attic space where anything with the divine name was actually just shoved up there, and that Geniza sat with tons and tons and tons of manuscripts gathering dust for centuries, really about 1,000 years. And so the Cairo Geniza is a positive treasure house for late medieval and early modern Jewish texts. The texts themselves are quite fluid, meaning their exact composition varies a bit from manuscript to manuscript. And as I said, they seem to have two different mystical origins, the descent literature and the Sar Torah literature. Although unlike previous scholars, modern scholars no longer think that one is derivative of the other. We now believe the texts actually developed independently and are equal in terms of their value and worth. Previous literature thought the Sar Torah literature was sort of a corrupt and diminutive version of the greater Hekhalot literature, but modern scholarship now says that they existed independently. That said, some of the major texts include the following. The first and the largest is the so-called Hekhalot Rabbati, the greater text of the palaces. This is the classic, the longest, and the most stable text, framed around the story of the 10 martyrs found in the Talmud. But it also includes hymns, adjurations, and instructional texts for the descenders as well. This text is extraordinarily complex, and there's simply no substitute for just going to read it yourself. Reading this text, one really gets a sense of the experience of the descent, its very real dangers. There's even a great moment where an angel nearly kills some of the descenders, and the descenders actually quibble with each other over who gave who the correct password at the right moment. So you get a sense of the real danger involved in this mystical process, where these angels are not just, sort of chubby cherubs. They're actually terrifying creatures, more than capable of killing people who intrude on the divine territory. One also gets a sense of the Baroque nature of the divine architecture with its various palaces and gates. You get this very strong sense of militant, powerful angelic guardians. One has a sense of the divine passcodes required to go through these various gates and their various guardians. And also, wonderfully, the final ecstatic hymn of the descenders as they reach the divine throne toward the end of the text. The effect of this text is positively dizzying, especially the final hymns and the kind of droning Hebrew original. There's also the Hekhalot Zutarti, the lesser Hekhalot, and also a text called the Ma'aseh Merkaba, the working or the doing of the Merkaba. These are manuals for descenders with various kinds of adjurations, and they also include descriptions of the famous water test that I mentioned earlier, in which the descender has to see through a kind of watery illusion or being driven mad or drop dead. The Hekhalot Zutarti also probably contains the oldest strata of this literature. So if you want to study the literature chronologically, you probably want to start with the Hekhalot Zutarti and then move to the other literature. There's also the Merkaba Rabbah, which includes various memory techniques for Torah learning. There's also the Sefer Hekhalot, the Book of the Palaces. This text is also known as Third Enoch, and it includes some pretty long narratives, and also includes in the Kairoganese manuscripts some additional magical material, so it's also interesting in that regard. I've also mentioned this whole business about the measuring of the divine body. This text is called the Shi'or Koma literature, the measurement of the heights, or the measurement of the vastness. You can translate it in a couple different ways. This is perhaps the strangest text in all of Jewish literature, in my opinion, which deals with the exact dimensions of the divine body, which are given very strange Hebrew names. Sometimes these names are dozens of characters long, and they're measured in the Persian unit, the parasang, which is about 3 miles or 5 kilometers. If you're curious, the beard of God, just for instance, and this is also something the Zohar will also be very interested in as well. There's an entire long text in the Sefer Zohar about the various dimensions of God's beard, is 11,500 parasangs in length, according to one manuscript. Further, the dimensions of the divine body are extraordinarily unusual. If you actually draw the measurements out, what you find is that the divine head is massive compared to the rest of the body. And this nakedly anthropomorphic depiction of God is otherwise completely alien in Jewish literature and theology. It's also very likely that when Maimonides composed the Guide to the Perplexed, he has this text in his sights. The constant repetition that God does not have a body, that God does not have a body, that there is no physical form of God. When Maimonides is sort of constantly droning at that, one has to imagine that it is the text Shi'or Koma that he has directly in his sights. This is a small gathering of the text. There are about a dozen of these texts that survive, like I said, in about 50 manuscripts in various states of stability and corruption. An important adjunct and likely separate stream from the Merkaba Hekhalot literature is the Sar Torah mysticism and its accompanying magical tradition. While in the Merkabah, the descenders travel to meet God, in the Sar Torah literature, it actually describes how to actually summon the divine presence to the actual theurgists. This text takes the form of a dialogue in which the Israelites long for the totality of rabbinical lore, from everything from exact legal codes to mystical secrets, the haRazim. This great Raz, or secret, is given despite angelic protests, a theme otherwise seen in rabbinic literature, in which the throne of glory itself descends. Notice that the divine presence is now the descender. It's not the mystics descending, it's the throne of glory itself descending. Once the throne descends into what at that point in the literature is the beginnings of the Second Temple, the Sar Torah, the Prince of the Torah, immediately provides all the secrets and lore through these crowns and signs. And this is why I think this literature is deeply mystical. The people in this text learn this lore non-discursively. They don't have to study the Gemara or study the Talmud. They simply learn this lore, these great secrets, immediately, mystically. This text somewhat reminds me of the Ars Notoria of the later Middle Ages, in which angelic and demonic powers are used to gain immediate knowledge of the liberal arts. I guess it's a lot faster than reading books and watching YouTube channels. There's also a much more clearly magical literature which situates itself within the Merkaba Hekhalot literature, but also the Sar Torah texts. And this is, of course, the most famous Sefer haRazim. It's sort of a combination of both the Sar Torah literature and the Hekhalot Merkaba literature. We'll deal with the Sefer haRazim in a future video as a part of our series on books of magic. The entirety of this literature continued to be produced throughout the Middle Ages, and there's even a small amount of a novel expression of this kind of literature in the Sefer Zohar. The literature seems to express a combination of mystical textual exegesis, mystical experience in the form of altered states of consciousness, and likely performative religious activity by the composers of the text. The literature itself seems to emerge from a vast matrix, which includes a definite smattering of biblical texts, which would include some of the literature from the Psalms, but also the Sinai vision of Moses, the Isaiah's vision in chapter 6 of that text, the famous Ezekiel Merkabah vision in that text, although the word Merkaba, of course, never appears in that text in those areas, along with several other sections from the Hebrew Bible. This anthologized biblical literature would also be combined with the basic background of the rabbinical lore, that is to say, the proto-rabbinical documents, but also including the Mishnah and the Talmud, and perhaps in later editions, the various Midrashim. And lastly, I think one has to combine the Greco-Egyptian and perhaps Mesopotamian magical traditions, and it's the unique combination of these three things, the biblical literature, the rabbinical literature, and the magical literature, that combine in a uniquely Jewish way to form the backbone of the Merkaba Hekhalot literature and also the Sar Torah literature. Again, the Sefer Yetzirah being the weird outsider here. The exact origins of these texts are very obscure, and there's a lot of debate among specialists. The authors seem to have been para-rabbinic or rabbinic adjacent. We don't know if they were exactly rabbis or part of the rabbinical institution. They may have been somewhere on the outskirts of the rabbinical institution themselves, somewhat like the clerical necromantic underground in the Christian world in the later Middle Ages. Further, these traditions seem to go back to the Second Temple period, and it seems to persist all the way into the Middle Ages, likely cultivating altered states of consciousness through ritual practices, including asceticism. We don't know exactly what those practices look like, but we're fairly confident, given the text, that there's some kind of ritual behavior, perhaps things like fasting and breathing exercises, that are underwriting some of these manuscripts. Indeed, I tend to think of these sort of para-rabbinical, mystical practitioners as something like Jewish shamans, and I don't like to mix those streams too much, but the idea of an intermediary between this world and a divine or supernatural or spiritual world in which the practitioner acts as a kind of bridge between those two worlds, reporting what goes on both sides of that bridge to each side, is something I think is typical of shamanic behavior. So I think in these Merkabah texts, I think we might think of these practitioners as something like Jewish shamans. Of course, the texts as we have them are not the direct stream of consciousness writings of the actual practitioners themselves. These texts are somewhat downstream of that ritual behavior in those mystical states. And so we have our phenomenological experiences and exegetical mysticism combined into a highly edited composite form in the Merkaba and Hekhalot literature. As I mentioned earlier, these texts also intersect the magical practices of ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia in a really complex and sophisticated manner that still hasn't been completely worked out yet by scholars. Just how these texts were transmitted remains a mystery. We don't really know how they got to be from being written in Palestine, then transmitted to Egypt and Mesopotamia. In fact, many of them could have actually been written in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, but then throughout their longer life ended up in the Rhineland of Germany in the High Middle Ages, being used by the Chassidei Ashkenaz mystics and the unique cherub mystics of the Middle Ages. So we don't know how these texts traveled. We don't know who was reading them. We don't know who was copying them. We don't know if mystical traditions actually invoking the Merkaba techniques survived, and if they did survive, how they survived. One must conclude perhaps they survived completely orally, the textual component surviving through the scribal tradition, but the actual practitioners actually surviving, or their actual practice surviving in some other mechanism. We just don't know. But just the exact rituals and mystical practices behind these texts and the transmission of these texts as a kind of tradition from Palestine into Egypt, across North Africa, and then from Mesopotamia, and we don't know the route that it took there, this is still the subject of immense scholarly debate. And again, this is part of the reason why I think studying Western Esotericism is so amazing, that we just don't know the answers to these questions, and we're just now, really in the past 100 years, digging into the real dirt of these problems. And it's going to be scholars, future scholars, that are going to be able to do some of this work and figure some of this stuff out for us. So this is why this field is absolutely exciting. You get to study such amazing texts as the Merkaba texts and the Hekhalot literature, but also you get to deal with real mysteries about how these texts and how these ritual practices and mysticism were transmitted. These are the texts, the Hekhalot and the Merkaba literature, that are going to form the foundation upon which Jewish mysticism, as we know it, will be built. And as I pointed out at the very beginning of this video, these were the dominant forms of mysticism for the first 800 years prior to the rise of the Kabbalah. These texts were clearly influential, so influential that it seems like when Maimonides sits down to write the Guide to the Perplexed, perhaps the greatest work in all of Jewish philosophy, it's these texts that he puts his sights on. There's something so disturbing and alarming in the Hekhalot literature and the Shiur Koma literature and the Sar Torah literature that Maimonides himself is going to write the entire text of the Guide to the Perplexed as a way of undoing that perplexion. In fact, one can even read the Guide to the Perplexed as an attempt by Maimonides to provide a more rational, and I don't like that phrase very much, but an anti-version of the Ma'aseh Merkaba, where rather than engaging in the Hekhalot literature where literally you're trying to descend into the Merkaba, Maimonides is trying to rescue the idea of the exegetical tradition by providing a philosophical analysis of what Ma'aseh Merkaba is, the doing of the Merkaba, so that it pushes away from the practical, experiential, phenomenological, mystical side of that tradition. In my opinion, the Guide to the Perplexed is written to be a kind of anti-mystical version of the Ma'aseh Merkaba, the kind of mystical practices encoded in this literature. I think a fascinating way of reading these texts is to read them and then go immediately and read the first sections of the Guide to the Perplexed and see just how much Maimonides is in conversation with this literature, even though the literature itself is somewhat in the background. But I certainly think Maimonides, the greatest of all Jewish philosophers and the greatest of all Jewish philosophical texts, is a kind of antidote to this kind of mysticism. Of course, the other important text we've mentioned here is the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation. We're going to get to it in a future video. The manuscript tradition of the Sefer Yetzirah is itself incredibly complicated. It has a vast commentary literature, and of course there are the philosophical and the mystical interpretations of this text. And you can't mention the Sefer Yetzirah without going into, at some level, the Golem legend. We will take a deep dive look at the Sefer Yetzirah as both a text of deep philosophical importance, but also deep magical and mystical importance in its own video. So stay tuned for that. If you're interested in Abraham Abulafia, or the rise of the Zohar and its accompanying literature, or Christian Kabbalah in the form of folks like Reuchlin and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, we're going to be dealing extensively with topics in Kabbalah, so make sure to subscribe. If you're interested in the Merkaba, mysticism, and literature, you're in good luck. There's been a positive explosion of analysis in this literature and its accompanying mysticism in the past 50 years. The single best collection of the text is published by Brill, which means it's prohibitively expensive. De Villa's Hekhalot Literature and Translation, major text of Merkaba mysticism, is the best scholarly edition, and it's in English, but I would get it through Interlibrary alone. I think the text runs about $160 on Amazon. His other text, The Descenders to the Chariot, The People Behind the Hekhalot Literature, is also great, but again, I would get it through ILL. His translation includes a really sophisticated critical apparatus and includes all the major texts of the Merkaba tradition, along with variant readings across the 50-some-odd manuscripts, and that's important. While there are older translations, especially of Hekhalot Rabbati and the Shiur Koma text online, those texts don't really reveal to you just how internally varied the literature here is. When you actually see it on the page where 3 or 4 lines of translation are accompanied by literally a half a page of notes explaining how every manuscript differs, and sometimes differs significantly, it's really worth getting a scholarly edition to give you a good sense of how difficult it is to prepare this literature, but also how internally diverse and rich this literature is as a form of text, but also as a kind of mysticism. Of course, the locus classicus for going to study this literature, along with much in the Kabbalah, is the work of famed scholar Gershom Scholem. These texts are getting a little dated at this point, but they're still a fantastic starting place, and they're relatively inexpensive. While I'm a little wary of his use of the term Gnosticism to describe some of this early Jewish mysticism, the best place to turn is definitely his text, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, if you're interested in the Merkaba literature and the Hekhalot text. So I would go there first. Again, this text, Major Trends, is relatively inexpensive, and it's still a solid place to start, although with all warnings, that literature is a little bit dated. I would also recommend the first volume of Joseph Don's History of Jewish Mysticism. It's a really solid introduction to all of Jewish mysticism, and it brings out a lot of debates on the current scholarship. And again, there is a lot of disagreement about where these texts began, who wrote them, why they were written, the degree to which they are magical or non-magical, and his discussion really highlights a lot of the differences about where scholars are on this material. Specifically, his analysis of the development of the exegesis of Song of Songs. One of the points I didn't make earlier in the video is how Joseph Don actually argues that a rereading of Song of Songs along mystical lines actually inaugurates the development of the Merkaba literature. It's a really fascinating argument and well worth checking out there in the first volume of Joseph Don's History of Jewish Mysticism, so check that one out as well. I'll also recommend the Arbel text, Beholders of the Divine Secrets, Mysticism and Myth in the Hekhalot and Merkaba Literature. What I like about this text is it does a really amazing job of locating the Merkaba and Hekhalot literature in the cultural context of the ancient Near East. And by locating it there, we begin to see the cultural, historical, and sociological environment in which these texts began to emerge. As I mentioned earlier, I don't like the idea of trying to define magic and mysticism in some kind of abstract philosophical way, despite the fact that I'm trained as a philosopher. I think you can only understand these terms in the context in which they're being used. And so when we look at these texts, we need to understand the cultural and historical situation in which they're being performed, in which they're being written down, upon the media they're being written down upon, etc. And her text does a great job of locating the development of the Merkaba mysticism in its larger ancient Near East religious setting. If you're interested in topics about Kabbalah, make sure to stay tuned. I'm already working on the next couple of videos, specifically on the Sefer Yetzirah and some of the new cutting-edge literature being done, dating and explaining exactly the cultural situation of the development of the Sefer Yetzirah, and also the very early cool Jewish magical text, the Sefer haRazim, which combines a lot of elements of Greco-Egyptian magic with Hekhalot mysticism. So if you're interested in that, those videos are forthcoming. Make sure to subscribe and consider supporting Esoterica on Patreon. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.